The Klamath County Badlands is a unique geological formation tucked deep in the Wainema National Forest. Just over a square mile in size, jagged rocks jut up from the forest floor, contrasting with the nature around it. I first discovered this place while looking at topographic maps. After my initial visit to the location, I decided to ask geologist Michael Hughes to venture out and help me understand how this rock formation came to be. Hughes is the Director of Environmental Sciences at the Oregon Institute of Technology. He's especially good at studying how a landscape formed and was the perfect guide for the trip. From Highway 97, we went east to Chiloquin and continued on Sprague River Road for almost 15 miles. We turned south on a Saddle Mountain Pit Road and drove 1.6 miles to Forest Road 22. Then drove another 7.4 miles. This route is easily accessible to passenger cars. From the parking spot, we headed east across unspoiled forest for a little more than a mile. The trees began to break, revealing the Badlands.
What I'm looking at is some palagonite tuff, and it's a welded tuff. It's a pyroclastic rock where the volcanic rocks are basically produced from the eruption, and they're kind of welded together. The clasts or individual grains of probably ash are fused together in this rock. Coming off that outcrop, we're coming off of a more crystalline rock, probably basaltic andesite, into this tuff. And it's increasingly more pyroclastic, and it's increasingly easier to break apart. And so this is very typical of welded tuffs that are fused together as the rock cools, and they're we would call them fissile, F-I-S-S-I-L-E. They're easy to break off into layers in which they were deposited. And they were deposited aerially, so these would have been kicked up, spit and sputtered and spurted, and they would be deposited in layers as hot clasts, and those hot clasts, as they cool, would fuse together and essentially weld themselves. So that's why we call it a welded tuff. And so this is what I expected to see. I expected to see rocks that we could break apart and take tabs of it and break it apart with your hands.
Let's pause for a minute to talk about some basic geology. Hughes believes the Badlands are a palagonite tuff. Palagonite is formed when magma comes in contact with water. The magma starts under the surface, beneath groundwater. When an eruptive event occurs, the magma begins to break through the surface. The hot magma meets the relatively cool water, rapidly bringing down its temperature and creating the palagonite rock. Because it cools so rapidly, small pockets of gas are caught in the rock, making tiny pockmarks called vesicles. Small bits of ash are also captured in the rock, creating dark polka dots called clasts.
You can see how it weathers into these blocks. These are basically cobble sized.
Yeah.
Whoa, check it out.
Whoa, hey.
That was cool. Look
there
at
it
it.
is. Nice.
There it is. You see how blocky and chunky this stuff is? It's readily coming apart. It's weathered. It's creating joints and the bedding planes. So the bedding planes are basically the layers like that, and the joints cut across the bedding planes. And where the bedding planes intersect the joints, you get a lot of weathering. So the water's getting in there. It's mechanically and chemically pulling the rocks apart, and it's pulling it apart in these blocks. And wherever these blocks are, create all these cracks and crevices for that particular reptile to live in. So it's likely that, you know, there are other animals or other creatures that particularly like this kind of habitat as well. The fact that you could break this apart, the fact that it's so easily weathered and eroded is what gives the Badlands landscape its character. You couldn't do this to the crystalline rocks. The crystalline rocks are much tougher. They're much harder to weather and erode, and so they tend to form larger, more massive, you know, sort of blockier kind of landforms. So in this particular piece, you can see the pyroclasts very easily, and these are the dark grains in here. And these are individual sort of cinder-like clasts, but if you look closely, particularly using a hand lens like I do, you can see that there's gas bubbles in these clasts, and those are called vesicles, and they're trapped pockets of gas as the rock cools. So this is kind of an interesting outcrop. You can see up here at the top where the weathering products are kind of really variable and kind of jagged. You can see the layers of the tuff that have been deposited as individual eruption episodes and then welded together. And then what happens is it kind of transitions into this more massive rock. And this rock probably also qualifies as a tuff. I can see individual pyroclasts in it, but it's a much more homogeneous layer. And this was probably erupted as a larger event. So here you see a series of, excuse me, here you see a series of smaller, probably more intermittent eruptions overlying the product of probably a more homogeneous, larger volume eruption, and a much more competent rock, a lot more resistant to erosions.
Does it say a lot about the geological history here?
What it says is that there was in this area a lot of groundwater present when this volcanism happened, and today there's still a lot of groundwater here. Trout Creek is a groundwater fed spring creek, if you will, and so we have, you know, a groundwater rich kind of geological framework here today, and it tells me that there was probably a groundwater rich geological framework when this eruption happened on the order of maybe 10 or 15 million years ago. Well, I think it's quite beautiful. It's a real contrast in style. We don't see, you know, these kind of landscapes everywhere in the basin. The jaggedness of the formations, the fact that they are so easily eroded, the fact that they have such a steep slope along many of the formations really makes a nice contrast when you're looking out across the Trout Creek Basin here in the greater Sprague Basin. You see a lot of buttes, a lot of volcanic buttes, but they're sort of, you know, rounded and dome-like. They're forest clad. They're much more like what we're used to seeing around the Klamath Basin. When you see these kind of volcanic formations, they're sharp and jagged, they're barren, there's not a lot of trees on them. And so the contrast that I'm looking at when I see part of the tuff formation in the foreground and our more stereotypical volcanic buttes in the background there in the Sprague Valley, I think is quite a beautiful contrast, definitely worth seeing.